In this month's session, Don, our carburetor expert, is going to teach Tom the finer points of servicing the Carter AVS and Holley 4-barrel carburetors. The great majority of all carburetor problems are caused by dirty, sticking external linkages or incorrect external adjustments. Let's find out what Don has lined up for today's program.
I'm going to cover the external linkages and adjustments on the AVS first, Tech. Then we'll do the same thing on the Holley. Just in case anyone is wondering, keeping the linkage clean and properly adjusted are most important to good carburetor performance. Problems can usually be prevented or remedied by performing these operations. However, before I start this session, I'd like to call everyone's attention to one thing. Make sure that air horn or float bowl cover screws, carburetor mounting nuts, and intake manifold mounting screws are tight and correctly torqued. A small air leak can act just like carburetor trouble, and you just might save yourself a lot of work by making this little check.
How about the vacuum kick unit on the 4 barrels? Is it the same as on the 2-barrel carburetors?
It works the same way, Tom. It has a modulating spring also, and is just as important to good warm-up performance. But let's review it. When the vacuum kick is correctly adjusted, the vacuum diaphragm pulls the choke valve partly open to allow just enough air to keep the cold engine running during warm-up. The vacuum kick modulates the choke coil and provides better choke valve control, which greatly improves engine warm-up performance. If the choke opening is too narrow, the engine will load up and roll. If it's too wide, the mixture will be too lean and the engine will stall. The service manual is still the best place to find the vacuum kick specs, also how to make the adjustments.
By the way, Don, I'd like to add something at this point. There's something you should be careful of if the carburetor is removed from the car. Be sure not to bang the vacuum kick unit. If the vacuum kick diaphragm bracket or link is bent, the adjustment will be affected.
Something I'd like to repeat here is to check the manifold heat control valve. If it's stuck open, you can be exact on all your carburetor adjustments and still have very poor warm-up performance. In fact, the engine may run like it's cold even when fully warmed up. The fast idle cam position guarantees the right idle speed for the amount of choke opening during warm-up. When properly indexed, the idle speed drops off at the proper time during warm-up. Correct fast idle cam position is obtained by bending the fast idle cam rod. To get the correct choke opening, make sure the fast idle cam isn't sticking and adjust by bending the upper angle of the fast idle cam rod. Detailed instructions are in your service manual and must be made before adjusting fast idle speeds.
Before we go any further, let me put in a word. There's one thing I want you to be sure of when setting fast idle cam position. The fast idle adjusting screw should be against the shoulder of the proper fast idle cam step. This guarantees that the fast idle cam will be indexed properly. If not set against the shoulder, the fast idle cam will move to the next step too soon as the engine warms up and the choke opens.
Thanks, Tech. That's a very important point. Fast idle speed adjustment instructions are also covered in the manuals and are easy enough to follow. Just make sure when adjusting fast idle speed that the engine is fully warmed up and that the adjusting screw is resting on the second step of the fast idle cam, not the start step. The accelerator pump, pump linkage, and bowl vent are the next items on the program. The accelerator pump and bowl vent are both operated by the pump lever, but must be adjusted separately. The accelerator pump adjustment affects the bowl vent opening, so this should be done first. Okay? The first thing to notice is the accelerator pump linkage. The 3 holes which change the accelerator pump stroke are in the pump lever instead of the throttle lever as on the BBD 2-barrel carburetors.
Do they affect the pump stroke the same as on the BBD?
Yes and no, Tom. The holes affect the length of the pump stroke, but opposite from the 2 barrels. The outer hole provides the shortest stroke, the middle the medium stroke, and the inner hole the long stroke. The middle hole should be used for normal operating conditions. In extremely hot climates, the outer hole, which gives you a short stroke, may be used. For very cold conditions, you may want to use the inner hole for a longer stroke. Before checking the accelerator pump stroke, open the choke valve enough to release the fast idle cam. The throttle valves must be fully seated in their bores, so back off the curb idle speed adjustment screw. You'll need a T-scale to measure the pump stroke. The accelerator pump stroke is checked by measuring from the top of the pump plunger stem to the top of the air horn. If adjustment is needed, bend the accelerator pump rod just below the pump lever. Now you're all set to adjust the bowl vent.
Does adjusting the accelerator pump affect the bowl vent opening the same as on the two-barrel job?
Yes, Tom. Remember that the vent opening must always be adjusted after the pump stroke. The accelerator pump rod must be in the middle hole for proper adjustment of pump stroke. If you're changing the pump stroke for extreme conditions, don't adjust the bowl vent until after you relocate the pump rod in the inner or outer hole. Incorrect adjustment of the bowl vent can cause performance problems at idle and off-idle conditions. If the vent does not open when the throttle is closed, it could contribute to rough idle, stalling, or hot start problems. If the vent does not close as the throttles are cracked, the off-idle mixture will be too rich.
The right place and way to check the bowl vent opening is to insert the specified drill or gauge between the vent and air horn at the end of the bowl vent lever where the opening is greatest. To reset the vent opening, bend the short tang on the vent valve lever. The choke unloader adjustment is next. To check the choke unloader, hold the throttle valves wide open. Then insert the proper size drill between the upper edge of the choke valve and inner wall of the air horn. With light pressure on the choke lever, the drill should have slight drag when removed. To adjust the unloader, bend the unloader tang on the fast idle cam.
You'd better be sure that when opening the throttle valves to use enough pressure to overcome the secondary throttle lever spring. This spring is very stiff, and if the primary throttle valves aren't open completely, the choke unloader adjustment will be wrong.
Thanks, Tech. The secondary part of the 4-barrel carburetor should get just as much attention as the rest of the carburetor. The air valve in the secondary is operated strictly by airflow. It doesn't open until the velocity is great enough. Here's how it works. The spring tension on the air valve must be enough to hold it closed as the secondary throttle valves start to open. This creates a vacuum in the secondary air horn to start fuel flowing in the secondary nozzles before the airflow is sufficient to open the secondary air valve.
Are there any adjustments on the secondary air valve?
Only one, Tom. Pretty important, too. You can use the detailed procedure in this month's reference book to adjust the spring tension. If air valve spring tension isn't right, here's what happens. Too little tension allows the air valve to open too soon when the secondary throttle valves are opened quickly. If the air valve opens too soon, you don't get that increase in vacuum to start fuel flow in the secondary nozzles. This can cause a hesitation, flat spot, or even backfire from a lean mixture. Too much tension will delay opening the air valve. As a result, the mixture will be too rich until the valve opens. This may affect both economy and performance. How about the secondary throttle operation, Don?
There are two things which affect the operation of the secondary throttle valves, the secondary lockout and the secondary throttle linkage. We'll cover the lockout first. The purpose of the secondary lockout is to keep the secondaries closed during engine warm-up. The secondary lockout tang engages the secondary throttle shaft tang until the fast idle screw is completely off the fast idle cam. If the secondary throttle valves were able to open during warm-up, poor performance would be the result. To check the secondary lockout, crack the throttle valves partly open, then open and close the choke valve. The lockout tang should freely engage the tang on the secondary throttle shaft. If it doesn't, bend the secondary throttle shaft tang until engagement is made with the lockout tang. The secondary throttle linkage has a connecting rod that may require adjustment to obtain proper opening sequence between the primary and secondary throttle valves. The secondary throttle valves should start to open after the primaries have opened about 60 degrees. To make sure they're opening properly, invert the carburetor and make sure the lockout is disengaged. Open the throttle valve slowly until the secondaries just start to open. Check for correct opening by measuring between the lower edge of the primary throttle valve facing the secondaries and the bore. If it is necessary to adjust the secondary throttle opening, bend the secondary throttle connecting rod. This adjustment may affect the clearance between the positive closing shoes, so be sure and check it. To do this, close the primary throttle valves all the way. You should be able to insert a 20,000th gauge between the positive closing shoes. Clearance is adjusted by bending the shoe on the secondary throttle lever. Well, that takes care of the linkage, Tom. Now...
I hate to interrupt, Don, but that takes care of this side of the record.